Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Around 2 million adults are dependent on drugs and alcohol in England. That's according to the latest statistics, with 1 in 12 having taken an illicit drug in the last year. Now, the word addiction is often used about overindulging in drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, even food. Is it, though, about compulsion or is it a choice? Russell Brand suggested that drug addiction should be treated as a disease and a health issue, to be treated with compassion rather than condemnation. Peter Hitchens thinks that's nonsense, telling us this back in July when discussing whether obesity was an illness.
People use the word addiction the whole time. There is no such thing as addiction. It has no existence. There's no objective proof that any such thing exists. And it's the permanent excuse.
I can hear Liz saying, yes, there is, yes, there is.
No, there isn't. There's absolutely not. There's zero. There is no objective evidence for it. You cannot establish its presence in the human body.
OK. And we'll hear from Peter again in just a sec. First, though, we met Adam Bradford, whose father David's gambling habit became so severe he ended up going to prison.
We'd never even seen him gamble, to be honest, apart from when we went to the seaside, and it's just what you do, you spend, a little bit of time going to the amusements and just doing the fun stuff that families do. But we never had any suspicions of a gambling problem.
The trigger, I think, for my entering into gambling in a more than social way was financial pressures brought on by mismanagement in the finance, my own personal finances, and that delivered me to a false sense of potential solution in gambling.
We found out through the front page of our paper that he'd stolen £50,000 from his employer and he had a gambling addiction. So, for us, we were kind of like, have they got, is this the wrong person? Is this the same David Bradford? But it was.
It's not because the core of me is bad, or I don't think so. I think it's that in the engine room of my mind, there's a bit of it not functioning properly. It's an illness which I've seen in other people now, and it manifests itself in a very similar way, but everybody's slightly different, and that's to do with their character that surrounds this illness, but the outcomes are always the same. We're kind of losers.
It's lost him his confidence and his job, his decency as a human. It could lose us our house. People who we might say are not addicted, who will turn around on the back of our story and say, it's his choice to do what he did. It affects the endorphins in your brain, just like drugs and alcohol do. That's been proven. We already know that the speed of gambling is getting quicker. There's many more adverts. The betting shops are expanding, and the industry is profiting from people like my dad who are getting into trouble.
The only thing I'm left with at the moment is trying to, day by day, edge into making things better for the future. Very, very difficult dragging that past with me, but it's the only way I can really function now. It's got to be treated like an illness because it's not a criminal thing. It might lead to that, but that's the result, not the cause.
Adam Bradford and his father David. Our question, is addiction an illness? What are your thoughts? Do email, text, call or use social media to get in touch with us this morning. Tommy will read some out a little later. Joining our panel this morning, actor and presenter Denise Welch, who says she's been addicted to smoking, drinking and overeating in the past. Dr. Aric Sigman, who's a health education specialist and author of Alcohol Nation. And Dr. Robert Lefever, who set up Britain's first rehab centre, one of them, and specialises in addiction and depression. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining our panel this morning. Peter, as you were the one that sort of set all this off when you came in the summer, I just want to read something back to you that David said, and just a reminder, he stole £50,000 to fund his addiction. It's not because my core is bad. The engine room in my mind has a bit that's not functioning. He very much feels he was addicted, but you say that's a fiction.
You can't, I don't want to intrude into anybody's private grief, but you can't diagnose yourself with a disease. And I would defy anybody to come up with an objective, first of all, an objective definition of what addiction means, which doesn't very quickly change into something almost entirely opposite to it when you use it 10 minutes later, and also to come up with any kind of objective diagnosis of its presence in the human body. You can't say that someone is an addict in any objective way using scientific methods. So
does that mean, therefore, that they're not?
Well, what it means is that we're discussing something else. We're discussing a moral question. We're discussing a question of a society which increasingly is not willing to attribute personal responsibility to people, which makes excuses for almost everything people do, which is bad.
So
and once you do that, it makes it much easier for people to do those bad things.
Denise?
Well, I mean, I don't come on here as an expert on addiction, but obviously we've talked before. I can only talk about my own, and I think that what addiction is doing, with my problem, it started with clinical depression, which happened when I had my first son, Matthew. And I always think that no matter how advanced people are in the medical world, unless they've actually suffered from clinical depression, it's very difficult to describe. And I admit that I started self-medicating to stop the pain. I would have done anything to stop the pain of my clinical depression, which led me down a road. I also don't say that I didn't sometimes use recreational drugs for that reason. But what happened, I then became a vicious cycle. The more I used, the more I needed, the more it was compounding my depression, till I found I was in a desperate, desperate place, and the only thing that I felt that would stop my pain was cocaine and alcohol. But I was functioning, so I was convincing myself that I didn't have that much of a problem because I wasn't hiding gin bottles under the sofa and I wasn't drinking in the morning, which a lot of people who do have more of a problem.
But was it an addiction? Because what Peter's saying is it's a choice. It was a choice for you to go down that route.
It was a psychological addiction with me, I think, which is different to a physical addiction. But as I say, I've been working recently with Spitalfield Crypt Trust and seen people who are in the throes of a desperate physical addiction. Right. I think it can be both.
Let's talk to the psychologist then. And Dr. Sigman, I don't know whether your specialism is neuroscience. Can you tell us what happens in the brain when somebody has a compulsion to take drugs or alcohol or food or whatever it is?
To cut to the chase, I partly agree with Peter. You probably assume I'm going to completely disagree. No, I do think that our society does not want to take responsibility initially for the dabbling in addictive substances. But there comes a point, and I've even brought a picture with me here, there comes a point when you start to see brain changes. So, for example, this kind of change here may happen with just one night of binge drinking in the last 3 months. The red area is there in a teenager.
And what are the red areas?
The areas are where the brain cells are thinner, weaker, with less coating, and 18 different areas where you see the red marks go thin. Now, what this implies is that what may start out as a lack of willpower and hedonism may end up with neurological changes and neurochemical changes, which then take on a life of their own, and then it does become a physical process. Now, it's difficult to be exact in the diagnosis. This you're absolutely right about, but it doesn't mean that it may not be an illness. I mean, let's face it, there are many alcoholics who, if you take their alcohol away, they will die from the DTs. That isn't just a social affectation. So I think it depends on what area of the spectrum you're on, and it can be.
There's a slight slippage there. People who die from alcohol die fundamentally from having abused and taken vast quantities of a very dangerous drug.
What about these changes to the brain, though? The changes in neurotransmitters?
We know so little about the brain. Trying to judge causation from these things is like trying to work out what the North Korean government is thinking from satellite pictures of Pyongyang. It really, anybody who knows anything about neurology, the really hard science, and this knows that its knowledge of the brain, its functioning, is incredibly limited
and growing very quickly.
Because we know so little, that doesn't make much difference. The truth is that we don't have any kind of causative proof of any connection.
That is a point, isn't it? I mean, we might have a relational, we might have a correlation between drinking and changes in the brain, but as far as cause is concerned, it's very difficult to prove.
Well, they're certainly finding causation in damage, no question of that.
Damage, no doubt, but that's very different.
Damage of areas which can control self-control.
Anybody who knows anybody who drinks a lot.
Damage to the prefrontal cortex, the area that will stop you drinking too much, becomes damaged. Then your ability to control your drinking in future may be compromised.
Anyone who knows anyone who drinks a lot knows that they're damaged by it, and anyone who's worked in Fleet Street for as long as I have has met plenty of people in that state.
I'm delighted to find that I'm in agreement with Peter on so many things. I think there's a lot of rubbish talked about addictive disease. I think there's a lot of rubbish talked about depression, about alcoholism and so on. I think it's much more simple than that. Some of us, I think, have an addictive nature. I'm not entitled to talk about anybody else. I can just say two things. I've got one. I believe I was an addict since birth. I didn't come to terms with it until I was age 47, by which time I was in so much trouble. Everybody else knew I had a problem.
What were you addicted to in your view?
Oh, right across the board. I'm an addict by nature. But the things that got me into trouble, I lost 3 months' income on the turn of one card in a poker game. My weight used to vary by 50 pounds up and down. I was smoking 30 cigarettes a day when I was on the heart ward looking after people who were dying of cigarette smoking related illnesses, and so on and so on.
But why? What did you put this down to? When you say, you talk about an addictive personality or an addictive nature. An addictive nature you talked about.
Nature,
but
I do
is it the sense then, as far as you're concerned, that some people are born with this addictive nature and they can't do much to shift it?
There are three causes. There's an antecedent cause, which I think is genetic. My mother's mother died of alcoholism, my father's father died of alcoholism, my wife's father committed suicide from his addiction, his father died of addiction, my mother had an eating disorder. My wife and I kept this genetic pool ticking over by marrying each other and breeding with each other. Our eldest son has addiction problems. He now runs a rehab. He's been very well trained for that. So I think there's just my family. But I've looked after over 5,000 inpatients. So I'm very familiar with other people's families. I've looked after the families.
Do you think addiction is a mental illness?
I think to use a term like mental illness conjures up so many other things that I'm equally concerned about. I don't like definitions that bring in things like mental illness, because it can be pejorative. It can be an abusive statement.
Could I raise a problem here, because it's important? The reason why this is so important is because of the way in which it causes us to treat the people who take illegal drugs.
Yes.
Also, I have to say, the way in which we treat people who destroy their families and ruin their own lives by drinking too much.
Yes.
Instead of saying, in the case of the illegal drug takers, you're breaking the law, well, we will punish you for it, we indulge them and say that they are suffering from a disease. We rob them institutionally. We rob them of the idea that they're responsible for their own actions.
I agree with you, Peter.
The same thing happens with people who drink too much. If you start telling them, this is a disease, you're not responsible for it, then they are relieved of responsibility. Human weakness exists.
I agree.
And to redefine human weakness into a polysyllabic, pseudoscientific word which relieves people of responsibility seems to me to be dangerous and wrong.
I agree with Peter on so much. It's a pity that we should disagree on anything, because I am totally responsible for my behaviour as far as it affects other people.
But it's about controlling that behaviour as well. What you're suggesting is you don't have control over your own behaviour.
Yeah, I don't have control. I have to find it.
Okay.
I'm not born with it.
And you have to treat the symptoms sometimes. It's like people who overeat. Of course, there are many people, and I'm sure you're probably the same as your colleague, who I won't mention, who is the eat less, move more. We all know that if we eat less and move more, we will lose weight. But I've been dealing with the programme that I've been on, which uses cognitive behavioural therapy. We have to understand that shutting the cookie jar tin isn't enough. When we've got these fat, these overweight children, there's a lot of pain involved in these children, and their comfort is the food. So it's not just as easy as to say, don't eat too much, run more, don't drink too much.
Never say it was easy.
Well, yeah, but the way you talk about it, Peter, does seem as if we can just say, well, we should just stop drinking because it's an indulgence.
It's not a question of being easy. It's a question of whether it's a compulsion or not. And the whole basis of the use of addiction in our society, particularly in the way we treat people who take illegal drugs, is that it is a compulsion. If it were not a compulsion, then the whole reaction of the legal system to heroin abusers would be wrong.
For some people, it is a compulsion. They'll kill other people. They'll do very extreme things to get the substance.
Well,
so again, it comes back to the question, what area of the continuum are they on? How severely dependent are they on this particular substance? And at some points on that continuum, it is a compulsion, and it is a point at which it is a disease.
The world leader in the brain scans that you've been showing is Daniel Amen. He's done over 100,000 of those within his clinics. I met him in California, and I was very impressed with the work that he was doing, looking at the way that the brain is plastic. it changes.
Specifically in young ages, those viewers
right.
right now who have teenagers at the moment, we know that it may switch on genes in the brain, making those teenagers far more likely to be addicted than if they waited.
Let's hit. Can I hear from those viewers,
cannabis.
because lots of people are getting in touch. Be with you in just a moment. Tommy, what are people?
Sian, yeah, Peter Hitchens, unfortunately, you're getting a lot of criticism on Twitter at the moment. John says, Hitchens is clearly, sadly, ignorant. Addiction is very real and frighteningly, often fatally tragic. It ravages individuals and families. This on Twitter says, addiction is real for sure and can't be simply dismissed by saying it's a myth. On the phone, though, Will says, as an ex-alcoholic, I don't think addiction is an illness, but rather just a very bad habit. Sean says addiction is an illness, but it's not like others. It's one that is only found out about after you start using drugs. And Simon's saying, nope, addictions are self-inflicted, like alcoholism and drug addiction as well. It's defo not an addiction.
All right.
Can I just carry on with what I was saying to Peter?
Yes.
About cannabis, I totally agree with you. It's a major damaging drug.
Oh, thank you so much. Do say that as loudly as possible.
I'll say it again. Cannabis is a major
Cannabis is a very addictive drug.
It'd be a crazy moment
And a very
to decriminalise
damaging
it
drug.
just when we're finding out how
totally
dangerous
agree.
it is. Thank you so much for saying
All
that.
right.
We'll talk.
Yeah.
And you will after this programme, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lots more to talk about.
I've been getting away with it all my